Well, Psalm 150 is what it means to be on mission with God. The mission of God is simply the fact that God deserves the worship and the praise of every living thing on the planet. And that's what the psalmist has in his heart as he's writing Psalm 150. This is the mission of God. The thing that's on my mind that I want to talk about today is this. Living on mission with God and the everyday stuff of life is a phrase that you could probably say all on your own. You really don't need me to bring that back to your attention. We all know that you and I are supposed to be on mission with God. It's something that we say frequently. You've heard it most of your adult life. The problem is, and what I've been contemplating over this past week is, what does that actually look like? What does it actually mean that I do on a Monday or on a Thursday afternoon? How do we do that? How do we live life on mission with God? What is it we're supposed to be doing? Because I don't want to miss it. Isn't it frustrating when you're given a task, but you're not really sure what it would look like if you were hitting it? I don't want that to be the case when it comes to such a critical thing. And so sometimes we can say things so many times that we have forgotten what it actually means and what it actually looks like. How would we know? When 18 years ago now almost, we were about to start the church here. We were about to begin gathering. And I remember panicking in my basement thinking, what if I mess this up? I mean, what am I supposed to do actually? And I remember praying, God, can you just tell me what's the most important thing and help me do that? Because maybe if I can get that right, would you forgive me for all the other things that I'll probably mess up? I just was desperate to lead well and for the church to be healthy and for it to be, for myself to be what God would want me to be. And so then I was reminded of one of the most famous stories that Jesus told. And we've reminded ourselves of the story many, many times here in this room. And here's my fear today is that as I begin to talk about this particular story, you may turn it off. You may be tempted to turn it off because you're going to already know this one, so I'm going to skip out. But ask yourself the question, what does it look like tomorrow for me to live on mission with God? And if you struggled with being specific on the answer, I would encourage you to hang in here. And let's listen again to this story that Jesus tells, maybe with new ears today. So why don't we do this practical? Just trade ears with someone beside you. Can you do that? Just do that. That'll help. Wow, tough crowd. Okay. It's going to be like that, is it? All right, let's do it. So Jesus is asked the question, what is the most important thing? What is the most important thing? And Jesus gives two answers. Isn't that crazy? What's the most important thing? Jesus says two things. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul and all your strength. And love your neighbor as yourself. And then I want you to notice what he says. There is no greater commandment, singular, than these, plural. You notice that? No greater commandment, singular, than these two things, plural, together. In other words, what's he saying? There can be no separation between these two things. There can be no separation between loving God with everything you have and loving your neighbor as yourself. Inevitably, a love for God will demonstrate itself in a love for other people. So an expert in the law comes to Jesus on another occasion and he says, how do I go to heaven? Jesus answers his question with a question, which is how you know it was Jesus. And he says, well, what do you say? And so the guy, being an expert in the law, he said to love God and love people, basically is what he said, the greatest commandment. So Jesus says, you have the right answer. Now go do these two things. He combines the two together, no separating those individually. So the story we're going to unpack this morning is really critical because it helps us to begin to understand what does it look like to be on mission with God and what does it look like to love my neighbor. Luke chapter 10 and verse 30. So when asked the question, what's the most important thing? Jesus is going to answer the question with a story, and he begins this way. A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho, and he fell among robbers who stripped him and beat him and departed, leaving him half dead. So you guys know that road that goes from Jerusalem to Jericho. You know, you've probably been there a lot of times. Jerusalem to Jericho. It's a pretty treacherous path. It's about 17 miles. You drop in elevation of 4,000 or so feet from one city to the next. And so to do that, there's a lot of switchbacks. It's like old westerns, if you've ever seen an old western where it's just dusty and dirt roads and there's little cliffs, you know, and you know the bad guy's going to be around the corner. That's what this road was like. So to walk on this road was a dangerous thing because people would hide and take advantage of solo travelers. And so Jesus is telling a story that they would relate to. And he says, so a Jewish guy's traveling on that road, and thieves jump out, and they beat him, and they rob him, and they leave him for dead. And as you hear the story, you're going to hear Jesus say, here's a couple ways not to love your neighbor. He continues in verse 31. Now by chance, a priest was going down that road, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. So likewise, a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. The priest works in the temple. He would be the pastors of the day. Okay, so when you hear priest, think pastor. He probably just left church. Pastor's on his way to lunch. That's kind of the story that Jesus is telling. So then he says a Levite, but when he says Levite, you need to hear that's the assistant to the priest. So it's kind of like the executive pastor at a local church. He makes sure that all the ministries are getting taken care of, that all the volunteers are coordinated, and that the vision that the pastor projects is getting accomplished. So Jesus says these two pastors, that's the story. The point was that for the hearers, they're knowing if any two dudes would have known to love your neighbor, it would have been the two pastors that just left the office. If anybody knew the most important thing was to love God and love people, it would be these two guys. That's what Jesus is saying. But, verse 31, now by chance a priest was going down that road, and when he saw him, he what? Passed by on the other side. So likewise the Levite, when he came to the place where he saw him, he passed by what? On the other side. Why, of all people, would they see a need as open as this one and do nothing about it? Why does their knowledge of this subject far exceed their obedience to it? So there's some reasons why we don't engage in needs that we see. And I think these were probably at play in the story that Jesus is telling. So if it's okay with you, let's unpack 3 or 4 of those. Was there something else you wanted to talk about today? This is okay? I feel like I'm at a meeting. It was supposed to be another meeting. So one is just fear, which that would be fearful, you know, if you're giving the wrong talk at the wrong meeting. Sometimes we don't engage simply because we're afraid. These guys probably had a pretty significant amount of fear. Just being on this particular road, as dangerous as it was. And it's also smart to be safe. Because when you're dead, you can't help anybody else. We were just in the Dominican Republic, and there were a few things that we did to try to keep ourselves safe because we wanted to be able to get up and work the next day. How many of you are so old that the church you grew up in had a library? So, I've heard, when I was a kid, they had a library at church, and so I would go and get these little missionary books. And I love reading all the stories. But the stories all went something like this. And at 21 years old, he decided to go to the people that God had called him to. And there was 18 inches of snow on the ground, and it was below freezing, and he had the flu. And yet he hiked for 6 hours in the snow anyway to reach the village, and he died. What a great missionary. True. But now he's not going to reach anybody else when the snow melts, you know what I mean? So you got to balance this out. And so the pastors are probably thinking, it's a dangerous road and we want to be safe. And so fear does play a part in why we sometimes don't wade into a particular situation, but there's some other things that we may be afraid of, and it might just be that you might just straight up embarrass yourself if you try to engage with someone else. We did that a lot too this past week, where so many of us were desperate just to say something to the people. There were so many people there that were serving us, and we just wanted to have a conversation with them. And we didn't speak Spanish. And so it was really awkward. And so some people said words that's not the word. You know what I mean? And so it were some awkward moments and embarrassing, but we risked it sometimes just to try to engage. So these guys were probably somewhat fearful. Another reason why they may not have met the need and they walked on the other side was just straight up for the inconvenience of it. And not just that it would slow them down on their walk to Jerusalem, on that road. The point is that there was this whole ceremonial thing that they would mess up. If this guy was actually dead and they touched him, it was going to take a whole week before they could go back to the office. Numbers, the book of Numbers tells us in chapter 19, it says, whoever touches the dead body of any person shall be unclean for 7 days. He shall cleanse himself with the water on the 3rd day, and on the 7th day, and so be clean. But if he does not cleanse himself on the 3rd day and on the 7th day, he will not become clean. Whoever touches a dead person, the body of anyone who has died, does not cleanse himself, defiles the temple of the Lord, and that person shall be cut off from Israel. Because the water for impurity was not thrown on him, he shall be unclean. His uncleanness is still on him. We're getting the picture. Don't touch the dead guy. That's what it's saying. And if you do, ceremonially, out of respect for God, God says this is what you have to do. And so these guys just may have been thinking, this is going to cause a real hassle for my work environment if I engage with this person who is in need. It's just going to be really inconvenient. I have more worship services to plan. If I stop, there'll be so many important things that I won't be able to accomplish. But how many times? I know. I said too many words. I hit my limit. How many times do we see a need and we're so concerned about the inconvenience that we talk ourselves out of the need? Let's talk ourselves out of meeting the need. Does that make sense? It's so easy to walk around it. How can a person to see the need, feel bad about the need, but walk on by the need? How do we do that? How can a person say, I love God with everything I have, and not love their neighbor? Jesus is saying we can't separate the two. Now, what does it look like to love your neighbor? That's how not to love. Jesus continues the story. Verse 31. Now, by chance, a priest was going down that road, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. So likewise, a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, as he journeyed, came to the place where he was, and when he saw him, what's the phrase? When he saw him, he said, what? He had compassion. I made you say it twice. Thanks. Thank you, Andy. He had compassion on him. Andy and I have been getting each other water all week because we had the sunny side of the house, but they put the strong on the back side of the house. The really great siding guys, they put on the back of the house. You know what I'm saying? That's really not true. They put the good ones on the front of the house because that's where everybody sees it. He had compassion. Don't miss that phrase, because of my water break. That's the phrase that pays. That's the bumper sticker for the day. That's on your coffee mug. That's what you need for the moment. He had, why did he stop? He had compassion on him. We're going to see Jesus define that in just a second. The deal is, Samaritans hated Jews. Jews hated Samaritans. They considered Samaritans half-breeds and not equal members of their society. They would have nothing to do with them. No way the Jews are going to travel through Samaria. They're going all the way around. The man who was dying would have considered the guy that stopped this way. They both were enemies. But, verse 33, he had compassion on him. That's what it means to love your neighbor. It's so much more than just being nice to your neighbor. So much more than just saying hi. It's so much more than not stealing their political sign during the night. He had compassion on him. Think about multiple times in the New Testament where Jesus is said to have had compassion on them. Feeding 5,000 people. He looks at all the people and he says, let's feed them. And then what does it say in the text? He had compassion on them, and so he fed them. Compassion means when you see a need, you do something about the need. Here's the phrase that God gave me while I was watching things unfold this week. So as construction's going on, as people are engaging, there's so many people in the community just kind of standing, watching. There were people that sat on a wall the whole day. You wonder what you would do if you turned off your cable TV and your streaming services? That's what you do. You sit on the wall and you watch your neighbors all day. There's nothing else. There's nothing else to do. They just sat and watched. And so I watched them back, And I watched this one girl that was working with our team as she was engaging with one of the people in the community, and she was just listening. And I said listening, and I pointed at my eyes. But the reason I did that is because we all know how some people are listening, but they're looking somewhere else. She was really listening well. And at some point in the story that this other person was telling, I noticed this girl's hand shoot right up to her shoulder. It was just reflex. And I thought, when the heart engages, the hand extends. When the heart engages, the hand extends. There's something about when we connect, and that's compassion. When we have compassion, it's not just see the need, feel bad about the need. It's see the need, feel bad about the need, do something about the need. Jesus saw the crowds that were sick. It says he had compassion on them, and he healed them of their diseases. Jesus saw a woman who had lost her son. And what does it say? He had compassion on her, and he raises her son from the dead. The prodigal son story that Jesus tells, and the father is standing at the mailbox waiting to see if today will be the day when his son comes home. And the scripture tells us that Jesus uses the same phrase that he's using in the story of the Samaritan that he uses when you're to love your neighbor. That same word, compassion. Luke chapter 10, verse 34, and the son went to his father, and his father bound up his wounds. Wait a minute, I'm on the wrong verse. Let's go back to Luke 10:34. So the Samaritan is there at the place, and let's go back to I won't be able to sleep tonight if I don't check this. Can I check this box? Luke 15:20. So he got up and he came to his father, and while he was still a long way off, what does his father do? His father saw him, and he felt compassion for him. Is that all he did? Apparently, when the heart engages, when the feet extend, because it says he ran, and he embraced him, and he kissed him, because he had compassion for him. Same word. Same phrase that Jesus uses. So back to the Good Samaritan story. Luke 10:34. So he went to him and he bound up his wounds and he poured oil and wine And then he set him on his own animal, and he brought him to an inn, and he took care of him. If we're going to be on mission with God in the everyday stuff of life, we need to see people the way that God sees people and have compassion on them. So that's what we need to do. We need to love God with everything we have. We want to be on mission with God. We want to love God with everything we have. And we want to see people the way God sees people. We want to have compassion on other people. So how can we actually do that? I want to just over the next few weeks put some handles on that so we can grab it, hold on to it, and know what to actually do. Because it's a concept in my mind. Be on mission with God. Love God with everything. Love your neighbor. Great. How do I do that? What does it look like? Let's use the word bless to kind of hang some thoughts on over the next 5 weeks. Today, we asked where we're going to begin. And we're going to begin with the first one, which is the letter B. And the letter B will stand for begin with prayer. Begin with prayer. And I know that's a little bit lame because prayer starts with a P and some of you are criticizing. But begin with prayer. The begin is going to be our letter B. Begin with prayer. Every single day, begin with prayer. And don't go, I was hoping for something more. Start here. Every morning when you wake up, even before your feet hit the floor, begin with prayer. It's such a critical piece. The one thing that Jesus did that fueled the work that he was accomplishing in his life, Mark chapter 1 tells us that every morning he would rise in the morning while it was still dark. He departed, he went out to a desolate place, and there he prayed. Get into the rhythm of praying first thing in the morning. Don't grab your phone. Don't check your email. Don't hit the news button or the snooze button. But begin your day with prayer. How long? I don't know. Just pray. What do I say? Don't know. Just pray. Don't worry about that. It might be, sometimes I pray as I'm sliding out of the bed. And before my feet hit the floor, I want to have begun my prayer. And some days I pray all the way to the coffee pot and I drink coffee while I'm praying. Other days my prayer is as long as it takes for my feet to hit the floor. Jesus, help me. You know what I mean? Some days are like that. But whatever it is, we begin with prayer. Why? It aligns us with our true north, Jesus, and it refocuses my heart on the gospel, which causes me to be grateful. We just sang about that. Causes me to be generous. We already talked about that. And it begins with prayer. Intentionally start every day with prayer. And it will move you from going through life with your head down to a life of mission on God. With God, on mission with God. How does that start? With prayer. Don't ignore it. Don't say, I'm going to wait to letter L. I'm here for letter L. Don't do that. Begin with prayer. When's the last time you prayed for somebody other than yourself? For others who are not your family or your friends or people who annoy you. When's the last time? It gets harder, doesn't it? Do you have anybody that annoys you? Have you ever had that? I see that hand. It's a revival of sorts. I see hands. All right. You know something that God said to me? Sometimes I have people that annoy, you have someone just annoys you. You see them coming, right? You see them coming and I don't have time for this. I know what they're going to talk about. I know what they're going to say. I don't have time. This is going to wear me out. It's going to be the same thing over and over. I'm like, get over it. I just want to tell them, get over it. Move on. Let it go. Stop it. And you know what God said to me? Let's just call this person Bob. If you're Bob, please forgive me. It's not you that annoys me. It is someone in this room, but it's not Bob, okay? So God says to me, Dean, yes, you're my Bob. I go to him all the time. It's always the same thing. I won't let it go. I just keep complaining. I keep asking when, why, what. God tells me the same things over and over. I'm good, trust me. I'm good, trust me. How annoying must I be? So I'm trying to reverse that and to begin to pray for the people that annoy me. Even pray for the people that hate me. Even pray in the moment when I go, what can I do for the mission of God? I don't know what to do. Pray. Begin with prayer. This is the way to love other people. Begin with prayer. Who's your neighbor? Anybody that God brings across your path. What does it look like to love your neighbor? To have compassion, to see the need and do something about the need. Even those people who bring it on themselves. Even people that don't believe like you. Even people that don't look like you. Even the people that annoy you. Let's begin with prayer so that we could become a church full of people who are willing to risk and wade into story, and a church full of people who never walk on the other side of the street. When I was thinking about this story, I couldn't help but be reminded as we get ready to take communion together. Jesus was willing to cross a street that was so incredibly wide, no one else could cross it. To get to the place where we are, our only option was that he crossed that street. It's our only hope. And was there fear? There was fear. Remember in the garden, Jesus says, any other way I can get out of this. Nonetheless, your will be done. Was it inconvenient? Are you kidding? He laid aside everything in order to serve us in this kind of way. So incredibly grateful that Jesus did not pass by when he had every right. And so today, as often as Jesus said, hey, this is my body and it was broken for you because I had compassion on you and I love you. This cup, my blood, so that your sins could be forgiven. And then we take it together just to remind ourselves of the power of compassion. You want to be on mission with God? I know you do. You wouldn't be sitting in the room. Let's begin with prayer and ask him to show us what it looks like.